This is Still Unanswered. I'm Laura Kensington. November 15th, 1959, Holcomb, Kansas. A neat farmhouse on a quiet country road. A town where people left doors unlocked, where church pews were full Sunday mornings, where the Clutter family, Herb, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon, were people you saw at the feed store, at club meetings, at the county fair. And then, in the span of a single night, everything changed. Nothing has been the same since. Nothing can ever be the same again. Today, we go back to that night and to the questions that stay with us. About motive, about how we tell stories of violence, about who gets humanized and who gets turned into a plot device. I'm joined by Dr. Michael Reyes. Michael, thank you for being here.
Laura, thank you. It's an honor to talk about this carefully. Holcomb still feels like a wound that won't close for a lot of people.
Let's start with the town. Describe Holcomb for listeners who, like many of our audience, know the outline of In Cold Blood, but maybe not the texture of the place itself. What was Holcomb in 1959?
Holcomb was a farming community, very small, a few hundred people, near Garden City in western Kansas. It was the kind of place where reputations matter. Church membership, 4-H involvement, a handshake is practically a contract. People believed safety came from knowing your neighbors. So when a family like the Clutters, who embodied those Midwestern ideals, were killed in their own home, it hit not as a crime, but as an existential rupture. It undermined a basic assumption that terrible things happen elsewhere.
Right. And we need to remember the Clutters as people, not just a case file. Herb was a prosperous, methodical farmer, River Valley Farm, active in civic life. Bonnie was quiet, religious, sometimes described as suffering from depression. Nancy was a high school clarinet player, a straight-A student, popular, involved. Kenyon was a shy, mechanically inclined teenager. They were loved. The funeral drew nearly 1,000 people. That image of a packed church sticks with me. Michael, when you look at that contrast, the everyday, ordinary lives against what happened, what does it tell us about the shock that followed?
It tells us how vulnerable community trust is. When normalcy is punctured like that, the ripple effects are social and psychological. People lock doors that had never been locked. Kids are watched differently. The town becomes, in a way, hyper-aware of mortality. There's a grief that's communal and also private. Neighbors who lost friends and coworkers, and families who never stop thinking, what if?
That private grief is one of our themes today, how the public story can overwrite private pain. Okay, let's move along the timeline. We have two men, Richard Dick Hickock and Perry Smith. The shorthand is they met in prison, they heard about a safe, they drove to Holcomb, and they killed a family. But it's never that tidy. Let's unpack who these men were. Michael, start with Hickock.
Dick Hickock was, on paper, more stable than Perry, railroad worker, mechanic. But he had a criminal record, petty thefts, bad checks, and after a car accident he displayed personality changes, impulsivity, risk-taking. He met Floyd Wells in prison. Wells, who used to work for Herb Clutter, told him a story about a safe with $10,000. Hickock seized on it as an opportunity for a quick, life-changing score. He positioned himself as the planner, glib, manipulative, someone who sold the idea of a perfect score to Perry.
And Perry Smith?
Perry's background is complicated. A chaotic childhood, parents on the rodeo circuit, time in orphanages, trauma, physical injuries, and a fractured sense of self. He could be artistic. He liked music and dreams of treasure hunting, but he also had a long rap sheet. He and Hickock connected in prison. It's important to say Perry was not just the monster. He was profoundly damaged. That doesn't excuse violence, but it shapes motive, impulse control, and how he reacted to Hickok's direction.
Many people come away from Capote's book thinking he made Perry into a tragic, almost sympathetic figure, and Hickok into the crude instigator. We'll get to Capote soon, because how the case was told became a second set of wounds. But first, the run-up. Floyd Wells, the jailhouse tip, it's a detail everyone knows, but I want listeners to feel the strangeness. These men drove 400 miles across Kansas into the night with a shotgun and a plan based on gossip. They checked rooms, found no safe, and then what happened?
The basic sequence, according to interviews and confessions, is they entered through an unlocked door, woke the family, tied them, questioned Herb about a safe that didn't exist, failed to find the $10,000, and, by their own later admissions, to eliminate witnesses. The killings themselves were close-range and brutal. Shotgun blasts, Kenyon tied in the basement, Bonnie shot in bed, Nancy in her bedroom shot. Herb's throat was slashed. Those details are stark, and they raise a question, one we will return to: the disproportion between a tiny take $40 or $50 and the level of violence used.
Yeah, they left a radio, binoculars, Nancy's envelope for church. A diamond ring remained on the dresser. It wasn't about the money they took. Here's a hard question. If the robbery narrative explains the logistics, how did it explain motive, or did it simply paper over something deeper?
Officially, motive was robbery, Hickok's belief in the safe, and premeditated elimination of witnesses. But from a psychological standpoint, we can't ignore that extreme violence can be expressive, not merely instrumental. There are dynamics of humiliation, envy, and rage at legitimate prosperity that sometimes animate violence. Perry's personal grievances, a life of neglect and brokenness, plus Hickok's bravado, could create a feedback loop. The act becomes not just about money, but about annihilating what you resent. That's speculative, but it's consistent with how two-person murderous pairs have acted in other cases.
Let's put it plainly. For many analysts, the crime feels like it was too violent to be pure. Let's put it plainly. For many analysts, the crime feels like it was too violent to be pure robbery. The idea that they murdered 4 people, 2 teenagers among them, for a few dollars sits uneasily.
Exactly. And that's one of the still unanswered elements. To what extent was the Clutter household a symbol? Were they, consciously or unconsciously, targeted because they represented order, security, and social status that Hickok and Perry lacked or resented? We can't prove symbolic motives, but the pattern, brazen planning, then gratuitous violence invites that reading.
Let's pause here. I want to bring the listeners into the investigation. For Holcomb, the discovery of the bodies, Nancy failing to show up at church, Bobby Rupp checking on her, this is when the town's life ruptures. Michael, talk about the initial investigation, the KBI, and Alvin Dewey's role.
Alvin Dewey and the Kansas Bureau of Investigation took the case. Early on, authorities were baffled. No signs of forced entry beyond the unlocked door, no clear theft of valuables, and a methodical killing. That made everyone consider extremes: contract killing, personal vendetta, or a transient criminal act. Floyd Wells's tip shifted everything. Once agents traced prison connections and followed the trail, witnesses who saw the men on the road, pawn shop receipts, bad checks, they converged on Hickok and Smith in Las Vegas. Arrest came about 6 weeks after the murders. It was a relatively quick investigative arc for such a heinous crime.
Wow. Okay. Arrested December 30, 1959. Then confessions. The public wants quick answers. They want justice. But then the trial starts, appeals happen, and in 1965, both men were executed. There are a lot of legal questions people have asked. Fair trial, adequate psychiatric evaluation. What stands out to you about the legal journey?
Two things stand out. One, both men were convicted fairly quickly, first-degree murder charges, capital sentences. Second, by today's standards, psychiatric evaluation and considerations of mental illness would probably be more pronounced. Back then, the bar for insanity was high. Even given Perry's troubled background and Hickock's pathology, the courts rejected those defenses. Appeals raised procedural and competence questions, but ultimately nothing overturned the verdicts. The legal system, in a way, sought closure. Yet, closure for whom? The community? The family? Or for a media-hungry nation?
And that question, who benefits from the story, leads us to Truman Capote. He wrote In Cold Blood and made the case a cultural touchstone. Capote called it a nonfiction novel, promised every word was true, and then used novelistic reconstructions of conversations and thoughts. Michael, you've studied media ethics around true crime. How did Capote's work shape the public memory of Holcomb?
Capote reframed the Clutter murders as literature. He humanized Perry, giving readers access to interior life that no journalist could verify. He also cast Holcomb as a symbolic landscape of American innocence lost. That had enormous consequences. It brought national attention, sympathetic interest in the killer's backstories, and a literary aura around violence. But it also meant that Holcomb's real people, the grieving, private folks, became characters in a narrative they didn't control. That tension between artistry and exploitation is at the heart of what we mean by still unanswered. What responsibility does a writer have when the subjects are victims and a living community?
And Capote was close to Perry. He visited often, he formed an attachment. Critics have suggested that personal bond might have affected his portrayal, romanticizing, excusing, right?
Yes. Capote's emotional involvement created ethical dilemmas. If an author becomes invested in subjects, especially those accused of atrocity, it's hard to maintain critical distance. Capote needed a compelling, morally complicated story. Perry gave him that. Observers later argued that Capote might have benefited from the executions because they gave his story closure and marketability. Whether that's true or not, the relationship invites questions about motive and method in narrative nonfiction.
There are also factual critiques. Capote reconstructed dialogues and inner monologues. He claimed veracity, but modern scholarship shows that some scenes were likely crafted or dramatized. So readers, then and now, are asked to trust a narrator who mixes documented statements with invented detail. That complicates how we use In Cold Blood as historical evidence. Michael, as a scholar, how do you advise people to engage with Capote's work?
Treat it like art, informed by reporting, not as straight history. Read Capote for literary insight into mid-century anxieties and the psychology of violence, but cross-check facts with court records, KBI files, contemporary reporting, and more recent scholarship. Be wary of taking reconstructed interiority as literal truth. And always remember, Capote's narrative choices shaped public empathy, often directing it toward the killers in ways that arguably softened attention to victims' interior lives.
That's important, because when storytelling focuses on charismatic criminals, victims risk becoming background. Our program is committed to centering the Clutter family, who they were, what they meant to Holcomb. So I want to pause, Michael, and read a detail listeners should carry with them. Nancy's envelope for church left untouched, a diamond ring on the dresser. They could have taken much more, but they didn't. That detail is almost unbearable.
It is. Small, tangible things anchor the senselessness. They remind us that real people with ordinary routines, saving money for church, jewelry on a dresser, were abruptly made the subject of violence. That everydayness is what public narratives sometimes flatten.
Let's move into the still unanswered territory. We'll take 5 questions that keep coming up and that don't have simple answers. First, was it really just a robbery? Second, did sexual violence occur, or was it attempted? Third, were there other victims? Fourth, did Hickock and Perry get a fair trial? Fifth, when does telling the story cross into exploitation? Michael, take the first, robbery or something deeper?
On robbery, the evidence shows they believed a safe existed and they planned accordingly. But the brutality, close-range shotgun blasts and throat slashing, suggests emotion beyond instrumental theft. Neither man got the payoff they expected, yet the violence was absolute. Psychologically, that combination points to more than money: resentment, rage, symbolic annihilation. However, proving that as a primary motive is inherently speculative. The official motive remains robbery. Our caution should be to allow both explanations to coexist in analysis.
Short interjection, Michael. Do you think the killers planned to murder from the start?
Yes. Testimony and later statements indicate an intention to leave no witnesses. That implies they were prepared for murder if the robbery went sideways. The question is, did they expect or intend the gratuitous level of violence? Perhaps not in full measure, but they were prepared to kill.
Second question. Sexual assault. There have been rumors, especially around Nancy. Autopsy and official files reportedly did not find conclusive evidence of sexual assault. Still, rumors persist. Why does this question linger?
Sexual violence is an emotive possibility that often enters narratives when young female victims are killed. In this case, a couple of things fueled rumors. Hickock's alleged interest in young girls, as suggested by some sources. Capote's insinuations that Perry may have prevented an assault, and the cultural salience of sexual motive as an explanation for brutality. But the autopsy record didn't find evidence, and the official investigators didn't conclude an assault occurred. The persistence of the rumor reflects our need to make sense of atrocity. Sexual motive can seem to explain brutality in a way robbery doesn't. But we must defer to forensic evidence.
Third question. Other victims. There were speculations about Florida, an unsolved family murder around the same time. How seriously should we take those links?
Investigators investigated but never proved connections. Hickock and Smith traveled after the murders through multiple states, and cold case investigators have periodically tested links with DNA exhumations. As of public reporting, there's been no confirmed link. It's possible they were only the Holcomb murders, but their post-crime mobility invites legitimate suspicion. Again, it's an area where curiosity meets evidence and where definitive answers have been scarce.
Fourth, fair trial and psychiatric evaluation. We've touched on this, but I want to be blunt. Did the system adequately consider Perry's background and Hickock's impairments?
By the standards of the time, they received the routine psychiatric scrutiny required. By today's standards, probably not. The legal framework for dealing with trauma, developmental disruption, and brain injury has evolved. It's possible that with modern evaluations, the narrative of competency and culpability might look different. That said, both men confessed and gave consistent accounts of planning and killing, which made the state's case robust.
Finally, exploitation. When does telling a true crime story cross the line? Capote made millions. Did Holcomb get anything but noise?
Ethically, storytelling about real-world horror requires attention to consent, to the wishes of victims' families, and to the ongoing harm caused by repetition. Capote's work immortalized the case, but not in a way that prioritized the Clutter family's privacy or the town's healing. Exploitation occurs when narrative choices prioritize drama and profit over dignity and accuracy. Responsible telling involves centering victims, contextualizing the community impact, and avoiding glamorizing perpetrators.
That's why this episode is called Still Unanswered. We're trying to hold those tensions, not resolve them cleanly. I want to read a short anecdote the source material suggests. Months after the murders, someone wrote that nothing has been the same since. Locals still avoid talking. Anniversary pieces talk about haunted towns. Michael, in your work with survivors and communities after mass violence, what does the passage of time do? Does it heal, or does it calcify?
Time helps, but it doesn't erase. Communities adapt, rituals change, locks stay in place. Children grow up with a different baseline of security. But trauma can be transgenerational. Families carry the stigma and the stories. Some people deliberately avoid public retellings. Others find meaning in speaking out. What's crucial is offering community control over the narrative, letting Holcomb tell its own story when it's ready, rather than outsiders deciding for them.
That's a key point. And today, the true crime genre, books, films, and podcasts, often turns on the tension of access. We ask, who gets to narrate? Who benefits, right?
Exactly. And the Clutter case is an early example of when cultural appetite and the lived reality of victims diverge.
Let's return to the killer's final days. Both were executed on April 14, 1965. There's footage and press accounts describing Perry as tearful and Hickock as stoic. People have read those final moments for meaning, repentance, performance, or routine. What can we responsibly infer from executions?
Not much about inner moral life. The performative aspects, crying, composing oneself, can be genuine or strategic. What matters more are the institutional and ethical questions. Does capital punishment address communal need for justice or revenge? In Holcomb's case, some residents felt closure. Others later wrestled with whether state execution was morally satisfying. It's a debate that continues beyond this case.
With that, I want to ask you something more personal, Michael. You grew up in rural Nebraska. How did the Clutter story land for you when you first encountered it? And has your perspective changed as a scholar?
When I first learned the story as a kid, it had that aura, mystery, tragedy. Growing up, people in small towns sometimes talked about it with a mix of fear and almost a cautionary tale quality. Lock your doors, watch your kids. As a scholar, I look more at structural variables, poverty, childhood trauma, penal systems that produce cycles of violence. I also see the pain that narrative fame causes communities. So my view broadened from personal shock to systemic context.
You and I, both legal kids in a way, keep circling institutional responsibility. Okay, we're roughly 2/3 through the episode, so let's make sure we give listeners some on-the-ground human details again. A few short anecdotes from the source material that help center the Clutters beyond being the family who died. First, Bobby Rupp, Nancy's boyfriend, was one of the first to discover the bodies and was briefly a suspect. Second, Ivana and Beverly, the surviving daughters, had their lives reframed by national attention. Third, the envelope on Nancy's dresser. These specifics matter. Michael, do you have a favorite micro detail that keeps the victims real for you?
I keep coming back to the Clutter's community ties, the 4-H projects, the church rolls, people who learned from Nancy her clarinet tunes, or from Kenyon how to fix a truck. Those small interactions are what communities lose. It's easy to get lost in the sensational elements. The mundane human skills and relationships make the loss palpable. It's easy to get lost in the sensational elements. The mundane human skills and relationships make the loss palpable.
Agreed. Let's move toward the end. What hasn't been answered? And what responsibilities do journalists, writers, and listeners have now? I want to leave listeners with a kind of ethical checklist.
3 responsibilities. 1. Prioritize victims' humanity. Use names, contexts, and life histories, not just the fact of their death. 2. Verify and qualify. If a narrative includes reconstructed dialogue or psychological speculation, label it as such. Don't let art masquerade as fact. 3. Consider community impact. Ask whether a new retelling reopens wounds or serves a clear public interest. If you choose to tell, do so humbly and with sources that center the affected people.
I'll add one more for listeners. Ask why a story compels you. Is it the mystery, the psychology, the moral correction? Once you know your attraction, interrogate whether your curiosity respects the dead and the living.
And also remember that unanswered questions can be a productive space. They push us toward better evidence, more humane storytelling, and a deeper understanding of violence's roots. Not every mystery will be solved, but the act of asking, responsibly, matters.
I want to close where we opened. Holcomb, 1959. A community accustomed to trust. A family who were neighbors first and names in a case file second. The Clutter murders remade that town's sense of safety. The story that followed, Capote's book, the film, the endless retellings, made the case a cultural object, sometimes at the expense of private grief. Still, the questions remain. Were the murders merely a robbery? Were there other victims? How much of the narrative was crafted for art? And crucially, when does telling become exploitation?
We might never answer all those questions, but we can choose how we live with them, by centering victims, by being rigorous with sources, and by resisting the easy seduction of charismatic killer stories. To the Clutter family and to Holcomb's residents, wherever you are, we owe more careful listening.
If you'd like to read more, we've included primary sources and archives in the show notes, KBI materials, court records, and contemporary reporting. We also list work that critiques Capote's methods. Thank you, Michael, for joining me and for holding the analysis with care.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to your listeners for engaging with this difficult case thoughtfully.
If this episode felt heavy, that's because it is. We owe that heaviness to the Clutters. I'm Laura Kensington. This has been Still Unanswered. For Herb, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon, remembered. We'll be back next week with another episode that tries to hold truth and ethics together. Fade out, piano.